hold it, and you light the fuse. You know, the odds of that happening have to be 1,000,000 to 1. Famous last words. I've always been interested in the odds. And some time ago, I came across some information that I thought was pretty interesting. You can probably guess that the worst odds on the planet are in Las Vegas. If you're planning a trip there, just, don't bother. Just give us your money and forget about it. If you play roulette, 5.62% goes down the hatch. That means if you play a $5 table for an hour, chances are you're going to walk away $30 poor. Now, if you play the slots like I do, the odds are even worse. Casinos make 2 or 3 times more. It's just like you're feeding the machines. Now, the odds for the lottery are even worse yet. Sometimes you wonder how sane people can buy those tickets, and yet we do, don't we? The odds are more likely that you will visit the moon than win the big jackpot. In fact, you're 6 times more likely to be struck by lightning than to win the lottery. In fact, if you drive a 5-mile round trip to buy a lotto ticket, you're 3 times more likely to be killed in a car wreck than to win the lotto. And yet we buy those tickets. Now, I found some odds on how you're going to die. Car wreck, chances are 1 in 100. Murder, 1 in 300. Fire, 1 in 800. Electrocution, which wire was it I was supposed to cut? Are you sure the power's off? 1 in 5,000. A flood, 1 in 30,000. A venomous bite or sting, 1 in 100,000. Killed by lightning, 1 in 2.8 million. By the way, the record for being struck by lightning is held now by a forest ranger named Roy Sullivan. He's been struck 7 times, no hair left anywhere on his body, and he answers to the name Matilda. Now, the odds by food poisoning are 1 in 3 million. I've been to some places in Northport that I'm sure where the odds are pretty better. But sometimes it just seems like the odds are against you. It just seems sometimes like the deck has been stacked, not in your favor. Do you ever feel like that? Periods in your life when things are just harder than they seem to need to be. A fellow named Brian Heiss had a day like that a while back in Provo, Utah. It's a true story. First, in the morning, his apartment became flooded when an upstairs apartment pipe broke. The apartment manager told him to go out and rent a wet vac. And when he went to his car, he noticed that he had a flat tire. So he changed the flat tire, went back to his apartment to phone a friend, but standing on the wet floor and using a telephone, he got a mild electrical shock that startled him so much he accidentally pulled the phone off the wall. Now, by the time he finished and was ready to go, the door had swollen because of the water, so he had to yell out to a neighbor to come and kick the door down. While all of this was going on, someone stole Brian's car. True story. Luckily, it was almost out of gas, so he found it a few blocks away. Still had to push it to the gas station to fill it up. That evening, Brian attended a military ceremony at his university, and he injured himself severely when he somehow managed to sit on the bayonet he had inadvertently left in his front seat. I don't want to picture that. Doctors were able to stitch up his wounds, but when he got back that night, he slipped on the wet floor and injured his tailbone. Listen to what Brian said. I began to wonder if maybe God didn't want me dead and just kept missing. When everyone and everything in your life just seems like it's conspiring against you to make you have a bad day, a bad week, a bad month. Today, I want to talk about facing overwhelming odds. Because there are places and times in our lives where the odds are against us no matter who we are. And there's a particular way that I want us to do it, and that's by fully relying on God. F-R-O-G. A few years ago, we were frogging all over this church, weren't we? But somehow, in the last few years, it seems like we just sort of let that slip away. F-R-O-G, fully relying on God. Sort of one of those catchphrases like WWJD, what would Jesus do? ASAP, always say a prayer. But what do you do when the odds are really against you? One of the names of God in Hebrew is Jehovah Nissi. I am the God who defends you. I'm the God who protects you. I'm the God who comes through when the odds are against you. Literally, I am God, your banner. And I think one of the greatest examples of someone fully relying on God happens to be in 2 Chronicles 20. One of my very favorite stories in the Bible. Somebody says, she says that about almost every scripture. And it's probably true, but this one really is a favorite of mine. The story goes something like this. 3 enemy nations, coalition forces, all around Judah had decided to team up against them and to come together and all attack at the same time. Now the king of Judah at that time was named Jehoshaphat. He was actually the 4th king of Judah after the divided kingdom. So this is somewhere in the 800 BC era. The king of Judah understands that he's in deep trouble. He understands this triple threat. Any one of those tribes by themselves could outnumber and outbattle Judah. All 3 together, not a snowball's chance, you know where. Perfect recipe for defeat and devastation for the people of God. But the reality is, they win. And I want to go through that story and show you how it happens. So that next time, later this same day, or perhaps it may wait till tomorrow, when the odds are against you, when you're facing one of those mountains that Jesus talked about, you're going to know how to be victorious, no matter what the odds are. 2 Chronicles 20. It's a wonderful story of God's protection for people who will rely on God. And I think it's recorded there not just to entertain us, but to show us, to inspire us, to instruct us, to encourage us to manage in our lives today. Principles on how to do battle against overwhelming odds. And some of you are in just such a battle this very day. For some people in our congregation, it's a financial battle. It just feels like there's just never enough. Sometimes it's the credit cards that spiral out of control. And sometimes that tyrannizing debt seems like it's never going to go away. For some, it's health situations, sometimes disease. There are those times when the options and the prognosis don't appear too promising. For others, it's emotional. For some, it's grappling with outlandish stress and depression. And for some, that dark cloud just doesn't seem to want to go away. For others, it might be a nagging addiction that has plagued you for as long as you can remember. Nothing you've tried up to now seems to help. If Jehoshaphat were standing in my place this morning, he'd probably say, listen, let me tell you about the odds. Let me show you what we did, and let me help you through it. And some of you would be saying, bolder than others, and some of us would be under our breath, easy for you to say, Jehoshaphat, you have no idea how bad things are for me. I feel like I'm going under for the third time. Well, let's see how bad it was for him and how he turned it around. Principle number 1, turn to God first. Turn to God first. Don't pass go. Don't collect $200. Take it directly to God and allow yourself to take on God's perspective. God who sees the end from the beginning. God who in one fell swoop sees past, present, and future. God who brings the eternal perspective that we don't have. Sometimes we need to get a bigger picture. Too often we see prayer as our last resort instead of our first thought. Something that we can do down the line, pray, if everything else that ought to help doesn't work. Well, you know, we've tried all the major things, and now all that's left to do is pray. All we can do is pray? Oh no, has it come to that? It's so hopeless that all we can do is pray? Listen, that should be your first choice, not your last resort. And if you want God to move in your situation and to help you overcome the odds in any area of your life, turn to God first. Verses 1 and 3. 1, this chapter starts out, and it came about after this. When you're reading the Bible, you don't just fast forward on through. After what? If you go back a chapter, there was a wonderful, great time of national revival, a spiritual awakening. There was great joy and prosperity in the land, and then comes the battle. Can I tell you something? With every high, there's a low. With every mountaintop, there's a valley. And after every big battle, there's a letdown. And after every blessing, there comes a period of testing. And that cycle continues all through our lives. Expect blessings and expect times of testing. The cycle goes through. Now, right now, as you sit here this morning, you're either in the middle of one, you're coming out of one, or you're heading into one time of testing. So don't be surprised. Be prepared. You're going to have blessings, and you're going to have battles. Notice the king's first reaction. He was afraid. A few years ago, I did a study that I shared with the congregation at that time about the bigger than life-size heroes in the Bible. Somehow we think they didn't have fear like we do. We think, they never trembled in their boots. We think they have this great big S on their t-shirt that says, Superstar! I did some very scholarly study on the t-shirts worn by biblical heroes. You want to know what I found out? They have a wee little S on them. It stands for Scaredy Cat. Scaredy Cat. They were afraid. Faith is not the absence of fear. It's being afraid, but trusting God as we move forward through it. It's not that we're afraid, it's what we do with the fear. We let it destabilize us. We let it demotivate us. We let it discourage us. And often we give up before the battle even starts. Say, you know what? I won't even try. Never let an overwhelming situation intimidate you. Turn to God. You say, well, how can my problems in life motivate me to pray more, to expect more from God, to get your priorities in right order, to rely on God sooner? Turn to God first, which is exactly what Jehoshaphat did. As soon as the people came to him and brought him the bad report, he turned to God. And then principle number 2, he talked to God. frankly and honestly about the situation. He knew something that sometimes we forget. No problem is too small for God, and no problem is too big for God. Verse 5, the king stood out before the people, and he prayed out loud, which, by the way, is not always a bad thing to do. Sometimes when we are praying to ourselves, do you ever trail off? I used to get really mad at myself when I doze off in prayer, especially during worship. No. It's almost my goal anymore, at night at least. He went out, and when you pray out loud, you get an opportunity to hear, and your mind won't trail off. And when the odds are stacked against you, there's a certain way you need to pray that may be different than how you normally do. And Jehoshaphat gives us that prayer, the 3 things you need to pray when you feel overwhelmed. First, in verse 6, he says, "Are you not the God of the heavens? You rule all the nations. Power and authority are in your hand, so that no one can withstand you." He went out and he reminded himself and the people of who God is. We sometimes forget. And we need to hear it said, God is bigger than the problem I'm facing. God, nothing is impossible with you. You rule over all the universe. You're bigger than all the nations. And secondly, verse 7, he reminded himself of what God had done in the past. God, didn't you drive out all of the nations before us? Didn't you give us this land in the first place? And brought us here? Remember the miracles that God has done in your life. Here at Suncoast, we love to tell the story of buying this 5 acres in the old building when we were 3 months old. We love to tell the story about spiritual bag people wandering over here. I mean, we weren't even incorporated. We didn't have a bank account. And we come here and look at a $500,000 piece of property. Somebody in the group said, "Anybody bring a checkbook?" And so when, in the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression, we were right in the midst of rebuilding, we didn't have to be afraid because we could look back and we knew that God who begun a good work in us was going to bring it to completion. That God had already shown God's self faithful on our behalf. So God, we remember who you are. We remember what you did in the past. And then in verse 12, will you do it again? Ask God for an instant replay. God, this is who you are. This is what you've done for us in the past. Now, come and do it again. Let's have a repeat performance. So the 3 questions. When the odds are stacked against you, are you not God? Did you not help us in the past? And will you not do it again? Very simple formula, and yet so many of us miss it. Third principle, and this is important. Tell God how you feel. God can handle it. You're allowed to confess your inability and inadequacy. It's okay to say, God, I feel threatened. I feel frightened. The king did that in front of his people. Verse 12, he said, we are powerless. The first of the 12 steps. We are powerless before these enemies coming before us. Nor do we know what to do, but our eyes are on you. Ever felt that way? The thing that I'm facing is so huge, and I feel so inadequate and so powerless to handle it. And then we remember the one who is all-powerful. Principle number 4, trust God to intervene. Turn it to God. You go to God, you talk to God, you tell God how you feel, and then you turn it over. Focus on God, not the problem. Said, we don't have a clue what to do, but our eyes are on you. The biggest mistake we make when we're overwhelmed and the odds are against us is we tend to focus on the problem. Have you noticed that? I mean, most people in tough times, when you ask them how they're doing, they'll say, "Oh, I guess I'm all right under the circumstances." Doing all right under the circumstances. What are you doing under the circumstances? What are you doing under the circumstances? Who put you there? Why don't you get on top of the circumstances? See, circumstances are like a mattress on your bed. If you get on top of it, you rest easy. You get underneath it, you're likely to suffocate. It's all in what you focus on. Corrie ten Boom says, "If you look at the world, you'll be distressed. If you look within, you'll be depressed. But when you look at Christ, you'll be at rest." Notice where are your eyes. You've turned to God, you've talked to God, you've told God how you feel, you've trusted God. And now notice God's response in verse 15. This is what the Lord says to you. Do not be dismayed or afraid because of this vast army that's rising against you. For the battle is not yours, but God's. The battle's not yours. Relax, God says, and trust me to help you. See, I think the reason that we're weary and fatigued and stressed out is because we're trying to fight battles that really aren't ours. They're God's. We assume God's role, and then out of sheer willpower and might, I will get this thing resolved and turn this thing around. We try hard, and we try harder, and we wear ourselves out. And then we get down on ourselves and go to confession, and we say, "God, I've really made a mess out of things. I've really blown it. I've really let you down." God interrupts us and says, "Wait a minute. You didn't let me down because you don't hold me up. I hold you up, remember? And if you'll get out of the way, we'll get through this thing." I know some of us are going to be going out of town for Thanksgiving, and some of you do quite a bit of flying. Any of you do some flying? Most of you have been on a plane at one time or another, though, right? So you kind of get the reference. I want you to picture yourself getting on a 747. When it starts taxiing down the runway, I want you to imagine getting up out of your seat and starting to flap your arms. And the faster the plane goes, the faster your arms go. You try to get one foot off the ground, then the other foot off the ground. The flight attendant comes and says, "Sir." For some of us, that would happen regardless of gender. "Sir, what are you doing?" "I'm helping the plane get off the ground." "Sir, you don't have to do that." "Oh, yes, I do. I'm committed to making this plane fly. I've got to get this thing to work." "Sir, it's okay. You don't need to do this. Just sit down, relax, and trust the force." "Oh, no, I can't just sit there and trust. I gotta try. I gotta help the pilot get this plane off the ground." And the plane takes off,